Sulfur dioxide. What is it? What does it do? And why do we use it? In 2013, the online publication Our World in Data released a graph displaying the amount of sulfur dioxide emissions that were released in almost every continent from the 1850s to the 2000s. The portion with the most emissions was South America, peaking in the 1980s with around 150 metric tons. In the same decade, North America came second with 140, quickly followed by Europe and eventually Asia and Africa. This graph shows that South America, North America, and Europe are the leaders when it comes to SO2. But before we get into the theories as to why this may be the case, let's dive into the definition of sulfur dioxide and describe what it is. Sulfur dioxide is defined as a heavy, pungent, toxic gas that is easily condensed to a colorless liquid. It is used especially in the making of sulfuric acid, bleaching, preservatives, and refrigerants. It is a major air pollutant, especially in industrial areas. In short, it is an inorganic compound that is also a poisonous gas which is formed by the burning of sulfur or sulfuric compounds. And just a note here, my explanation of South America will be used in comparison with the other continents mentioned in this video. SO2 is known for its odorous smell, which resembles the smell of burnt matches, dying fish, and rotting eggs. The gas occurs naturally in volcanic eruptions and the occasional hot spring, but is released more often in the burning of fossil fuels, which contain sulfur. When sulfur dioxide enters the atmosphere via power plants, eruptions, or car exhaust, it combines with water vapor to form sulfuric acid, which forms the acidic rain which is so detrimental to the environment, but more on that later. If you look at the map of SO2 emissions, you will see that South America obviously has the largest amount of them, and that they have kept this record for quite a long time. But interestingly enough, there were quite a few points of reason as to why their emissions kept growing. To see this, we are going to look at 3 different decades of time, the 1930s, the 1950s, and the 1980s.
Shorn. When I was a little girl, a patron of art left me $1 million for my musical education. But I thought I couldn't live on the income from $1 million, so I asked all my rich friends for tips on the market. They gave them to me, and I lost my $1 million. Now the only thing I have left is this chinchilla coat of mine, which I paid $25,000 for. And are there any bears in the house? If there are, I wish you'd buy my coat. From now on, my hands are off the ticker and on the piano keys. And my advice to you is that if you're lucky enough to have $1 million, hold everything. And above all, don't play the stock market.
When the stock market crashed in 1929, many countries that were not incredibly industrialized faced a problem where they could not afford to import needed products. These countries, especially those in South America, began to move from importing products to producing their own. With this, countries like Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Honduras, and Ecuador began to make their own cars, food, and industrialized projects that would be sold to their own people. Because of this, their SO2 emissions grew by around 10 metric tons in just a decade. With this new method, some nations grew more rich and used their money to modernize themselves even farther by building factories and eventually exporting their own goods to the countries they had once bought from. By the 1950s and 60s, most of South America had used these methods to support their own industries despite the failure of many of their states. More people in urban centers had cars, more modern homes, and worked in industrial jobs. Public transport expanded, roads were built, and trains became common. In Brazil, 98% of their consumer goods were supported by their own domestic businesses. It was at this time that the economy of South America grew more rapidly than the modernized West, and their sulfur dioxide emissions rose up to 80 metric tons. In the 1980s, South America was still trying to better their economy, even though their country's people were constantly struggling with changes made by their governments. But one thing that didn't change was the way they were making products. And like all the other countries that had been using the same equipment for several years, they were still producing a lot of sulfur dioxide with their factories and cars. The burning of coal and natural gas was also increasing. This was their peak of sulfur dioxide emissions, which were far over 140 metric tons, and it was around this time that the world had become more aware of the environmental and health consequences of SO2 and air pollution. When the United States Environmental Protection Agency passed the Clean Air Act in 1970 and later amended it in 1990, many Western countries created new policies for themselves that were very similar, and South America, wanting to become more respected by its neighbors, followed suit, and their SO2 emissions fell by 50 metric tons by 2010. In 2016, more than 50% of the continent's energy was produced using renewable power sources, far over the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's average. So why is South America still the largest producer of sulfur dioxide on the map?
When we talk about the largest hydropower project in the world, in 2014 the Three Gorges Dam held the world record, producing 98.8 million megawatt hours, but at the end of 2016 this dam produced 103,098,366 megawatt hours and established a new world record in annual generation. This monster dam is the Itaipu Dam on the river Parana, bordering Brazil and Paraguay.
Despite South America's efforts to expand hydroelectric power across the continent, SO2 emissions remain a little higher than other places due to its unstable governments, dependence on manufacturing and mining, and presence of income inequality. Due to the incredibly high gap between the rich and the poor and the difficulty of access to modern technology in rural areas compared to urban places, the ability to decrease air pollution varies from each place. Highly populated cities could afford to switch fossil fuel-run power plants to those controlled by water and offer cleaner technologies, transportation methods, and products to its inhabitants. But poorer villages in South America could not afford that. In more rural areas, a lot of the emissions of sulfur dioxide are resulted from daily activities. In rural areas, modern forms of public transportation are practically non-existent, and most people make their way around via older fossil fuel cars, while poor cooks use wood stoves or fires that pollute the air heavily with smoke. In addition to this, agriculture in parts of South America are notorious for the use of the slash and burn method, which involves the burning of a place heavy vegetation in order to clear land for farming. With this being said, it could be assumed that while the levels of SO2 gas are decreasing in more populated and industrialized countries, it is remaining around the same in those less fortunate. For the North America section of this video, we're just going to focus on the United States, which had significant rises of SO2 emissions in 1915, 1930, 1940, and from 1950 to 1980, according to the graph. When World War I launched in Europe during July of 1914, it took the U.S. 3 years to join, but despite their late arrival, the country had already been experimenting with new technologies and weapons for the past decade. During the Second Industrial Revolution, every country was competing with each other in some sort of arms race. Nations were developing their own type of poisonous gas, gun, tank, airplane, ship, and submarine in case of war. Industry was booming and capitalism was doing better than ever in the United States. With the appearance of the automobile in the second half of the 19th century, American companies like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler became more and more relevant as they gathered investors. And when World War I began, armies began to look towards cars as another way of transportation besides the traditional horse. Since World War I was not fought on U.S. soil, American troops had to be transported to Europe via boat or ship, often run by steam engines, releasing hundreds of pollutants into the air, including sulfur dioxide. And once they were in Europe, those that were in the Air Force had to fight using inefficient biplanes. At home, women took up jobs in the expanding appearances of factories, which would build artillery, weapons, and vehicles amongst other war goods. Shipbuilding became an extremely important business in the United States, and as the Allied powers in Europe struggled with oil shortages, the U.S. came to their aid by using these ships to send imported oil from Mexico despite their own coal shortage. After the Great Depression hit in 1929, the industrial state of America was in complete disarray. The businesses that had been doing well before, such as businesses around automobiles, electrical goods, construction, coal, and railroads, were failing and struggling to get back on the market. One of the reasons these companies failed was because they often depended on the income of their consumers. And with the stock market crash, millions lost their savings and could afford to buy almost nothing. Thousands lost their jobs and many became homeless. And although it seems that SO2 emissions would have gone down due to the absence of a big auto, coal, or oil industry, the map suggests the opposite. If you look at the map, you will see that from 1930 to 1940, sulfur dioxide emissions rose by 10 metric tons, actually more than the previous 2 decades. And although this may seem confusing, there may be 2 reasons that might explain the rise. When many Americans lost their jobs, it was difficult to become employed again. Businesses that still survived wanted younger people that were also experienced, and didn't want to pay them a lot of money. The government was trying to help, but more often than not, their intervention failed. For example, when the automobile industry begged the United States for federal backing, they received nothing. Few old jobs existed, but luckily there was one industry that actually grew more and more rich during this period, the non-durable items industry. This industry involved the manufacturing of radios, processed food, clothes, shoes, and tobacco. Factories that dealt with this type of business hired hundreds of people, and the demand for their products grew, leading other places to produce similar goods. Canning and packaging goods became really important in the 1930s, and as companies began to have more revenue, more complex industries, like those involving chemicals or medicines, began to start up again. Paper and cigarette production also rose as the demand for them got higher. So what does this all have to do with SO2? Well, with the increasing demand for non-durable goods, more and more factories had to create products for its consumers. Canning and packaging also led to more sulfur dioxide into the air when paper was bleached. Additionally, the Midwestern states during the 1930s had to face the Dust Bowl, a result of the desertification and drought of the area during the 1920s. As major dust storms covered the area, wind erosion occurred, releasing a lot of sulfur that was in the soil into the atmosphere.
As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
After entering the war in 1941, the United States had begun a major project in which they would build hundreds of weapons, artillery, metalworks, aircrafts, bombs, and transport systems for the military. With men being drafted, women looked to work in the factories for both the war and supply for the higher demand of consumer goods. With factories constantly expanding, more and more pollutants were being released into the atmosphere. And unlike World War I, where automobiles were used often, but not always, cars were constantly used during this fight, and as faster cars were of higher demand, so was the demand to burn more fossil fuels in order to create more energy, releasing even more SO2 into the air. Like the troops, many ships and planes built in America were transported over to Europe, sometimes via inefficient boats. During the 1940s and 50s, most middle and upper-class Americans owned a fossil fuel-run car, leading to smog problems in urban cities. For example, in 1943, the smog got so bad in Los Angeles that people thought it was the Japanese launching a gas attack. Since people did not know that car exhaust contributed to smog, they were terrified. Throughout the 40s and 50s, Californians sported gas masks in an attempt to avoid the haze which burned their eyes. Policemen on motorcycles were distributed masks, and salesmen even tried to sell clean air to the city's inhabitants. Smog, which contains sulfur dioxide, could lead to acidic rain or air quality, as well as respiratory problems. After World War II, the United States economy was prospering. With this, more construction projects were put in place, and more factories were built. New cars were designed, and they were faster than ever before. Though with the dawn of the Cold War and the fear of a nuclear threat, Americans still worked on improving both regular and military technology. Homes were improving, and a lot more came with luxury-type features like heating. With more and more people entering the U.S., more SO2 was being released into the atmosphere, and this habit kept going until the 1980s, when the EPA finally focused on air pollution by setting restrictions and amending the Clean Air Act. From 1980 to 2010, the emissions of SO2 dropped by 50 metric tons. Like both South and North America, Europe has only a few points of interest on the graph: the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1950s, 1980s, and 2000s. Though interestingly enough, the patterns of Europe's emissions aren't exactly the same. Prior to 1910, there had been a steady rise of SO2 emissions on the continent, but this rise eventually staggered down to a stagnant line around 1910 through 1920. Part of the reason for this could have been due to World War I. Although World War I did release a lot of SO2 into the air via the creation of some poisonous gases, the use of aircraft, steamships, and scorched earth methods on the battlefront, European industry had gone down by a lot. Since coal mines and factories were being destroyed or taken over daily, the ability to use these facilities lessened. Most of Europe actually imported their raw materials and artillery from outside sources instead of making their own. Additionally, as more and more men joined the war and regular citizens moved away from their homes to avoid danger, these industries also lost hundreds of workers. Factories were often located in areas where the war fronts were located. The best example of this is France. Prior to the war, France produced over 75% of Western Europe's coal, iron, linen, sugar, and wool supply, but by the time the war ended, their production dropped down to 25%.
The responsibility lies on the shoulders of one man. By his latest act of naked aggression, Hitler has committed a crime not only against Poland, but against the whole human race. Against the mothers and children leaving the cities of Britain under the great evacuation scheme with a smoothness and speed that avoids a single accident or delay. As they start out on what to them is the great adventure, already German troops, guns and planes have crossed the Polish border to kill and to destroy. So Britain prepares to fight, and never in our history have we been so united in the knowledge that our cause is just. We have no material interest in the quarrel between Germany and Poland, but we shall be fighting for something which is vital to our life and to the life of all civilized people. For in a world where the rights of the weak and the honor of the pledged word can be overruled by the high hand of military power, there is no tolerable life for nations or for peoples. So in spite of our hatred of war, we must meet force with force. And as our children move from the crowded cities to the kind care of newfound friends in safer places, what a tragic contrast to the preparations for the horrible struggle that may lie ahead.
In the 1920s and 30s, Europe was hit pretty hard by the Great Depression, but as World War II draw near, so did higher sulfur dioxide emissions with the rise of military production. As the war came closer, countries like Britain and Germany increased production of vehicles and artillery. Huge industrial and infrastructure projects also occurred during this time, and fossil fuels were used obsessively, seen especially in the construction of new oil pipelines. By 1938, Britain held 25% of the world's industry, and them, using it to their advantage, uses economic placement to develop new technologies that would be used for the war. With the expansion of factories and construction projects during this time, SO2 emissions rose. Additionally, as European towns were being bombed, continuously removing topsoil and ruining natural environments, more and more sulfur was being released into the atmosphere, leading to more acid rain across Europe. From the 1950s to the 1980s, most of Europe's SO2 emissions could probably be attributed to an attempt to rebuild both of the economy and infrastructure of pre-war Europe. Some of it could also be linked to increased industrial production and mining of fossil fuels in places such as Northern Europe and the Soviet Union. In places like the UK, smog also became an extreme problem, as seen in the Great Smog of London in 1952, which was triggered by post-war production of low-grade sulfurous coal.
When we hit 35,000 feet, we'll have reached the tropopause, the great belt of calm air, as close as I'll ever get to the ozone. I dreamed we were there. The plane leapt the tropopause, the safe air, and attained the outer rim, the ozone, which was ragged and torn, patches of it threadbare as old cheesecloths, and that was frightening, but I saw something only I could see because of my astonishing ability to see such things. Souls were rising from the earth far below. Souls of the dead, of people who had perished from famine, from war, from the plague. And they floated up like skydivers in reverse, limbs all akimbo, wheeling and spinning. And these departed souls joined hands, clasped ankles, and formed a web. great net of souls. And the souls were 3-atom oxygen molecules of the stuff of ozone. And the outer rim absorbed them and was repaired. Nothing is lost forever. In this world, there is a kind of painful progress, longing for what we've left behind, and dreaming ahead. At least I think that's so.
Like the United States and South America, the 1980s was the peak of SO2 emissions, and as the population grew more concerned about the environmental consequences, more and more laws and policies were made by European governments in an attempt to decrease air pollution. The 1980s also saw the creation of new organizations in the EU, such as the UNECE and the Montreal Protocol, which was created after the hole in the ozone layer was found in Antarctica and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. But despite all of these efforts to decrease emissions, the release of SO2 has been slowly rising since the year 2000. This is probably due to Europe's increasing population, economy, and industrial production. Sulfur dioxide emissions in Asia did not rise significantly until after World War II, as seen in the graph at around the 1950s. For this section of the video, we're going to talk specifically about Japan. After the war, Japan became extremely involved in manufacturing until becoming an economic powerhouse. The country began exporting clothing, appliances, washing machines, refrigerators, TVs, radios, and cars all over the world. As the Japanese market expanded, so did the demand of consumer goods, resulting in a rise of mass production in factories. Urbanization spread and industrial buildings began popping up all over Asia. When Asia looked to improve their infrastructure by making it more Western, the continent had to import iron and steel from other countries to support their construction projects. Crude oil, iron ore, and coal were also imported and brought to more populated cities, where they would be burned or used in factories. The result of this was extreme air pollution. During the 1950s and 60s, coal was the most common source of energy in Japan. Factories, buildings, and homes that used it sent black smoke into the air, releasing hundreds of toxic particulates into the atmosphere. Additionally, most Japanese machines used in factories for the burning of raw materials did not include technologies like dust collectors. Since the 1960s, Asia has seen a rise of SO2 emissions. This is probably due to a lack of environmental policies and an expansion of factories in the manufacturing industry as Western countries continue to import more and more from them. According to the graph, sulfur dioxide emissions were not remarkably present in Africa until the 1950s and 60s, when many African nations became independent of their colonizers. Prior to decolonized Africa, the Western powers that controlled the continent did not encourage independent industrial projects that were not connected to the Europeans. The logic behind this was basically that without modern technologies or consumer goods, Africa would have to keep relying and importing from Europe in exchange for their valuable raw materials. Like South America, in the second half of the 20th century, a lot of countries began to create their own goods so they would not have to import as much. This substitution method was seen in Nigeria, Tanzania, Zambia, Ghana, and Madagascar, though it was not very successful. During the Korean War, production and manufacturing of consumer goods began to grow more common in Africa due to the lack of resources their importers had, who were preoccupied with supplying the army. In the 1980s and 1990s, a wave of nationalism came over Africa, and with it came laws that its states made restricting foreign businesses. The government, wanting to head towards the international market, briefly focused on industry. The construction of power plants grew, and Africa began to produce many non-durable goods in these factories. This increase of production led to 50 metric tons of SO2 by 2000, 30 more than it had been in 1960. Since the year 2000, SO2 emissions in Africa has been continuously growing. As years go by, many African countries are making efforts to become more industrialized. In 2017, 10,000 factories were counted on the continent. And in the last 20 years, Africa's oil, natural gas, and petroleum industries have been becoming more and more relevant in the global economy as multiple investors from around the world are investing in African manufacturing projects. Though despite the improving African economy in places like Nigeria, Zambia, Tanzania, Ghana, and Ethiopia, one thing that's getting worse is the air quality. And although the African continent has less factories and power plants compared to other places, its output of sulfur dioxide and other pollutants is alarming. Africa has received global pressure to lower their emissions from many non-government organizations, like Groundwork and the Center for Environmental Rights. South Africa especially, groups from around the world are questioning the country's decision to ignore the consequences their coal-powered factories are having on the environment, and their basically useless laws that do not even follow the 2015 Paris Agreement guidelines. Sulfur dioxide does nothing but pollute the environment, but despite this, we still use it due to its properties. Sulfur dioxide is used to bleach paper, preserve foods, and make wine. And when we aren't using it, we are unknowingly releasing it. Every time someone drives a fossil fuel car, lights a fire, or builds something industrial, SO2 is released into the air. And because of this, sulfur dioxide is present basically everywhere on Earth. Now, of course, sulfur dioxide could occur naturally from things like volcanoes, but most of the emissions, 99% in fact, are due to human sources. SO2 is everywhere. It's in the smog, the acidic rain, and in the very air we breathe. It is a threat to everyone's health as it causes breathing problems, but luckily, if you look at the map, SO2 seems like it might be on its way out in some countries, and although it is also rising in other places, one can still have hope to the growing awareness and concern for the Earth's well-being.
Time was when an American about to go abroad would be warned by his friends or the guidebooks not to drink the water. But times have changed, and nowadays a foreigner coming to this country might well be offered the following advice. If you visit American City, you will find it very pretty. Just two things of which you must beware. Don't drink the water and don't breathe the air. Pollution, pollution, they got smog and sewage and mud. Turn on your tap and get hot and cold running crud. See the halibuts and the sturgeons being wiped out by detergents. Fish gotta swim and birds gotta fly, but they don't last long if they try. Pollution, pollution, you can use the latest toothpaste and then rinse your mouth with industrial waste. Just go out for a breath of air and you'll be ready for Medicare. The city streets are really quite a thrill. If the hoods don't get you, the monoxide will. Pollution, pollution, wear a gas mask and a veil. Then you can breathe, long as you don't inhale. Lots of things there that you can drink, but stay away from the kitchen sink. Throw out your breakfast garbage, and I've got a hunch that the folks downstream